Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and we've been holding off on this video for some time now. But ever since we found out that Dr. Pershing has been taking blood samples from the adorable Go-Gurt and injecting it into other bodies, we have to assume that it is possible that Baby Yoda's blood is somehow connected to Supreme Leader Snoke. So why is that? Well, let's take a look at all the facts. We know that Dr. Pershing has taken blood samples from Baby Yoda and found an extremely high M count. M count most likely means midichlorians. High midichlorian density in one's blood equals natural mastery of the Force. From what we can tell from Dr. Pershing's message uncovered in Chapter 12 by Mando Dad and Company, the doctor was able to harvest a small amount of blood from Baby Yoda and then inject it into a so-called volunteer. Although there were initial successes in the experiment, the body of the volunteer ultimately rejected the blood. Now, this last statement is pretty interesting. What are the initial successes that they were talking about, and what exactly is the point of this entire project? Ever since scientists uncovered the secret connection between the midichlorian and the Force, not only have massive amounts of original trilogy Star Wars fans been very pissed off, it's also led to the belief that a transfusion of midichlorian-rich blood can transfer the power of Force sensitivity as well. When Kaleesh warlord Grievous was injured in a starship crash, his body was completely torn to bits. Count Dooku had purposely orchestrated the incident and had wanted to save Grievous and then turn him into a cyborg slave. While Grievous was being transported to medical facilities on Geonosis, Count Dooku injected blood into the Kaleesh warrior from the frozen body of Jedi Master Sifo Dyas. He did this for two reasons. One was to keep Grievous alive, and two, there was hope that Sifo Dyas' blood would give the Kaleesh warrior Force abilities. Unfortunately, it did not, and the lack of Force powers would go on to be Grievous' biggest weakness. So the assumption here is that Baby Yoda is most likely being used for a very similar purpose. Moff Gideon and Dr. Pershing are trying to create Force-sensitive individuals. Now, from what we can tell from Legends Star Wars lore, blood transfusions to create Force sensitivity generally don't work. If we take a look at the Legends Darth Plagueis novel, Darth Plagueis found that midichlorians generally desert the body once the host dies. The same thing usually happens when blood leaves the body of an individual. Midichlorians seem to be connected with life itself, and it has some role to play in keeping beings alive. This is most likely why Grievous survived his very arduous trip after his crash. It was the blood of Sifo Dyas and all the midichlorians that most likely were frozen in that blood. Darth Plagueis also did many experiments with different test subjects that involved manipulating the midichlorians inside of them to extend the being's life. At the same time, Darth Plagueis sensed that the midichlorians were semi-sentient in one way or another and actively resisting him when he was trying to make them do very unnatural things. Darth Plagueis eventually, with the help of Darth Sidious, was powerful enough to force the midichlorians to bend to his will. Darth Plagueis would run experiments where he would intentionally flatline a subject and then force the midichlorians to stay inside the body, keeping the individual alive. Now, of course, in the case of Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious, they have immense Force powers, and to this date, the only way to really affect midichlorians and keep them inside the body is by using the Force, so Dr. Pershing and Moff Gideon might have some obstacles they're going to face. Plus, Darth Plagueis' experiment is actually different from transferring midichlorians to another being. This latter process could potentially be a lot more difficult. It might require constant persuasion to the Force to keep these midichlorians in another alien body instead of their own original body. Then there's that small issue of compatibility. We know that human beings can't just accept blood transfusions from anyone. There are certain types that are compatible and so on. And in the case of the Kaleesh Grievous, he was getting blood transfusions from Sifo Dyas, who's a human being, so I'm sure there were all sorts of biological complications that occurred. The same could be said for using Baby Yoda's blood on volunteers who I assume are a different race and most likely humans as well. So how does this all connect to Snoke? Well, from what we can tell after the Galactic Civil War ended, the most functional Imperial remnant forces that were left were most likely assigned to the contingency. Moff Gideon and his men were most likely also a part of that larger plan. The contingency was created by Emperor Palpatine in the event of his death. Palpatine had told his protege Gallius Rax the following: "If an empire cannot protect its emperor, then that empire must be deemed a failure. It collapses not only because its central figure is gone, but because it must not be allowed to remain. Now, as you can tell, Palpatine is a pretty vindictive individual. I mean, he basically wants to destroy everything because he can't have it. And so while general chaos was created by this Imperial scorched earth, individual agents of the Empire quickly began setting up the foundation for a new, improved empire. And so shortly after the Battle of Jakku, a large portion of this Imperial remnant began venturing into the unknown region. Using the information gathered by Palpatine's observatories and probe droids along with notes from the Chiss warrior Thrawn, the Imperial remnant is most likely still struggling to survive in the unknown region by the time the Mandalorian TV show takes place, just 4 years later. This was a terrifying ordeal for the Imperial remnant. They would have lost several ships by this point to gravitational anomalies, even more soldiers to the various Xeno threats in this area. They were basically really struggling. And it wasn't really until Supreme Leader Snoke and his navigators found the Imperial remnant that they had much of a chance of survival at all. Now, we don't have the exact dates to when Snoke joins the Imperial remnant and turns them into the First Order, but I'm going to assume if this Baby Yoda Snoke connection is true, then it would have happened sometime after The Mandalorian. Now, Snoke is an artificial strand cast, which means he's a bioengineered being. And as we see in Episode 9, Snoke was cloned several times by Palpatine in the Sith Eternal Cultus. It's important to note that Snoke's body is disfigured and scarred. What's even more interesting is that the cloned versions of him look grotesque as well, so these weren't naturally sustained injuries from disease or physical altercations. Generally, when a body is being changed by the Force through a very unnatural way, it begins to become disfigured as well. If we take a look at Darth Plagueis' experiments on many different animals, they became very disfigured when he started messing around with their midichlorians. The dark side of the Force also seems to have a corrupting effect on flesh. Just take a look at any heavy dark side Force user and you'll notice the stench of decay and death. When Palpatine came back to life using a cloned vessel of his former self, it's clear that the procedure is not perfect and Palpatine's new body is slowly falling apart. I believe that Moff Gideon and Dr. Pershing are doing important research for the technology that will one day create Snoke and perhaps even Palpatine's host body. Right now, it seems like the current goal of the Baby Yoda project is to infuse Force sensitivity into another being. This might be the first of many steps to creating a Force-sensitive stormtrooper. Now, the main issue that we've outlined before is neither Moff Gideon or Dr. Pershing are Force-sensitive, and from what we can tell, it seems like for this kind of midichlorian manipulation to happen, it does require at least someone with an understanding of the Force. So I guess one of the positives of Moff Gideon kidnapping Baby Yoda once again is we'll finally figure out why he wants this little adorable guy's blood and what he plans on doing with it. This is our theory. We think it's probably connected to Snoke and Palpatine in one way or another. Let me know in the comment section below what you think. Maybe you guys have found something that I haven't. Anyway, guys, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.